All right, so I want to start with, so this is where I left off on Tuesday, talking about, of course, Southern slavery. Hadn't really gotten to Southern culture much yet. Uh, Began my lecture on Tuesday with uh, the profitability of slavery, how it was a $1 billion industry in 1860 and things like that, leading to the Civil War. And that key to maintaining, and probably talk more about this later, but key to maintaining that profitability will be an attempt to expand it. And so, I've been reading a lot of things, I had some time yesterday and I went back and looked at uh, a historian that I've been heavily influenced by is David W. Blight. He's an historian at Yale University. He's just an extraordinary historian, very good lecturer, very good writer. His most recent book, I read this past summer, was a biography of Frederick Douglass. It's just an incredible book. It's a great book. Um, it's thick, of course, because it's a biography. All biographies are thick, but it's a great book. But anyway, so you can get all his lectures from Yale. I mean, you can go to Yale. You can view all his lectures on YouTube. You can go to iTunes, and I've downloaded all of them. I listen to them. That's what I do, right? But you get the transcripts of his lectures. And I was just looking through some of them, and I came across this. So what he's done is, of course, many of his books are based on primary source work, including looking at the account books of slave traders. And so I wanted to share some things with you to kind of reinforce this idea of the profitability of slavery being the key cause of civil war. One section of the country really wanting to hold on to it, and another not so much. So he's looking at an account book. Starting to wear reading glasses now. I'm getting old. But anyway, I calculated in Hector Davis's account book that the biggest week he had, and he had some big weeks, but he had a week in 1859 where he made a cool approximately $120,000 in profit. So he's reading through these account books, and it's Hector Davis, a slave trader in Virginia, right? $120,000 in a week in 1860 in trade and sale of slaves. Now, kids, I've been teaching. This is my 27th year of teaching. I've got a master's degree plus 18 credit hours, and I'm still making well below that, which is okay. I live a good life. I'm not complaining. But this guy made that in a week, right? Selling slaves. And they're trying to tell us that the reason why they want to hold on to slavery is because it's paternalistic, right? And he goes on, there's more here. I would be showing this to you, but I can't get my gosh dang. I've got a document projector that's not working. But anyway, this is on my iPad. But it's amazing to read the letters in the language of slave traders when they write to each other. The complacency, the mixture of just pure racism on the one hand and just business language on the other. So here he's quoting some slave traders, right? And their communications with each other, their letters to each other. I refused a girl 20 years old at $700 yesterday, one trader wrote to another in 1853. If you think best to take her at 700, I can still get her. She is very badly whipped, but has good teeth. Bought a cook yesterday, wrote another trader. Bought a cook yesterday that was to go out of the state. She just made the people mad, that was all. Listen to this. I bought a boy named Isaac, wrote another trader, for $1,100. He writes this in 1854 to his partner. Bought a boy named Isaac. I think him very prime. He is a house servant, first-rate cook, and splendid carriage driver. He's also a fine painter and varnisher, and says he can make a fine panel door. Also, he performs well on the violin. He is a genius. And strange to say, I think he's smarter than I am. And Dr. Blight goes on to say, truth always creeps through all of our language. It doesn't always, but sometimes creeps through our language, doesn't it? In other words, yeah, intelligence is not based on race. Intelligence does have a connection to heredity, but it's not based on race. Intelligence is also based on environment, experience, and opportunity. Here, a slave trader is actually admitting that a boy he purchased is actually more intelligent than he is. Strange to say. Anyway, just wanted to share that with you to give you kind of a thinking of the time period and some of the profit that was going on, of course. But of course, what I left off the other day with is slaves coping with this environment. And you read a little bit of that in your chapter, and you had a question on it uh, in your homework, which most of you answered very well. I don't know anybody got a perfect on these questions, though. I was pretty picky on these, so make sure you continue to do a good job on those. Take a look at them. But one of the ways in which to cope, of course, was slaves developed close family ties. And this was encouraged by slave owners, of course, but much of this was encouraged for breeding purposes. Remember, the international slave trade had been outlawed in 1808, and the way to profit in slaves, as these Virginia traders were doing, was through domestic slave trade. If you're not bringing in slaves from overseas, then you have to perpetuate the product within the country. Once again, there was some illegal smuggling of slaves coming to the country. I told you about the Clotilda the other day. But you can imagine how heartbreaking this must have been, once again, if you're developing these common ties, these family ties that are encouraged by slave owners, even marriage in some cases, and then separation could happen at any time, in which these relationships could be instantly separated, and family members were often separated. Now, slave owners in the Upper South will profit by selling slaves to the Deep South or the Southwest. May have mentioned that the other day. This map turned out a little blurry, so I apologize for that. But it was the best one that I saw that kind of showed the patterns of sale, right? So from the upper southern states on down into the deeper southern states. And once again, as a slave, you did not want to be sold down the river, because typically that is where the harder life was. Once again, think about John Brown's example in the chapter in which he was putting in 18-hour days. Now, this sometimes even happened with slave masters who could consider to be perhaps a little bit more paternalistic, or maybe once again more humane, right? And we tend to think of Jefferson that way, right? And I'm sorry if I'm bringing him up too much, but obviously I've done some reading on him recently, so he's fresh on my brain, and we've talked about him, so I think it's a good connection. And sometimes he's defended as a more paternalistic slave owner, but even in those cases, for instance, when Jefferson passes away, some of his slaves will be sold down the river, even though he did want to prevent this. And credit to him, he was hoping this wouldn't happen, but that's not what happened. And I did some digging on that. I went to his website on Monticello. Okay, I have got to visit Monticello. It must just be an extraordinary place to visit. And it doesn't appear to be one of those sites. Sometimes you go to these presidential sites, kids, and it's all glory and heroism, right? They don't necessarily get into the icky stuff. Looks to me like they're very balanced at Jefferson. What was good about him, what was bad about him. And they have pages on his website that talk about, some of the things that we are troubled by with him. And this was a good quote from the 18th. So this is after Jefferson's death. We have a slave auction at Monticello. 2 years after this, Mr. Jefferson died. Then began our troubles. We were scattered all over the country, never to meet each other again until we meet in another world. So this is a quote from Peter Fawcett, who was one of Jefferson's more loyal slaves, a skilled blacksmith. You guys remember the article we read where Jefferson freed some of his skilled slaves, right? Because he thought that maybe they could function in society. Peter Fawcett was one of those. So he was freed. He's a skilled blacksmith, had been very loyal to Jefferson on his plantation. Problem is, his family members weren't. So Fawcett's freed, but his kids and his wife, and they're still enslaved, right? And this is supposedly a paternalistic slave owner, right? And these are the things that are occurring. Even with a man supposedly paternalistic, he had to find ways to try and buy. His family was scattered. He had to try and find ways to buy him back. And this is a great site for this. And then here we see Jefferson's sale of slaves, kind of scattered, and some are indeed sold to deeper parts of the South. I think this one here, one of his freed slaves settled in the free. I don't know if you're aware, but there's a colonization movement that occurs. There are those who believe that African Americans would be better off living outside of the country, that they won't be accepted. So there is a colonization movement that occurs. The free country of Liberia is founded on the west coast of Africa. And I think this is probably depicting at least one of Jefferson's slaves settling there, if I remember reading correctly. Okay, so you can see where all the slaves after his death are kind of scattered about the country. Some did manage to go north. The Hemmingses, some of them were able to live even as free whites because they were so fair-skinned. Okay, so just bringing up how sometimes this paternalism, even if you have a paternalistic master, it sure has its limits, doesn't it? Right? I mean, why wouldn't this man, if it's so paternalistic and he's a skilled blacksmith, why can't he have his family and freedom? Oh, I know why. Because Jefferson had tremendous debts and his family was trying to pay him off when he died. So these people were sold to try and pay that off. And the only slaves that were freed were the ones that he specifically said should go free. Okay. So we've talked about the slave auction a little bit, so I wanted to highlight that. I just mentioned the slave auction that was at Monticello. Slave auctions were brutal sights, to quote. This is actually quoting Solomon Northup. Families were ripped apart, often never see each other again. And I think you can make a strong argument that this was slavery's greatest psychological horror. You know, I think the two things I always say about slavery, I mean, obviously the violence and, you know, rape's obviously a pretty horrible thing to do, somebody incredibly horrible. But the other thing that's purely bad about it is, you know, you kids have great promise in your lives. You have choice. You're making choices now with some of the things you do, right? You know, you're choosing to take on challenges. You want to be successful. You have some control over your destiny. I think the worst part of slavery is not having control of your destiny. The other part would be being ripped away from your family members. I think that would be incredibly difficult. I mean, think of the people that hopefully you've got some people, I would imagine your kids do have some people you love very much in your life, and imagine being ripped away from them. Okay. So I've got a film on that. I told you I really wasn't giving you a lot of notes today, but I'm going to post all my notes if you want to ask questions about anything I don't get to, because I'm not going to be able to finish this one. I don't want to lecture to you every day. But I want to show you a film, a depiction of a slave auction here. Maybe you've seen it. It's from the History Channel. It was part of their Story of Us series, which came out in the early 2000s, pretty popular with teachers. But this is a depiction of what Solomon Northup described, which you should have read the other day. Hopefully you can hear it okay.
Punishment is savage for those who risk escape, but some will do anything to be free. 1841, New Orleans, ground zero for the slave trade. It's auction day, the day every slave fears the most. In the first half of the 19th century, over 500,000 slaves are sold at auction. It's a business worth $2 billion to the Southern economy. Since the cotton boom, the value of slaves has skyrocketed. Now men cost $1,000, women $800, children $500. Solomon Northup, an educated free man from the North, was kidnapped into slavery.
He would make us hold up our heads, walk us briskly back and forth, while customers would feel our hands and arms and bodies, make us open up our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for or purchase. Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his sale.
90% of all African Americans are slaves. 4 million men, women, and children.
We had based this country on everyone having inalienable rights to freedom and equality, and yet we created a system of abject persecution.
Slaves are fattened for auction, like livestock. Dark-skinned men are bought for the fields, light-skinned women for the house. Traders lie about their ages, even dye a slave's gray hairs.
For the plantation owners, it was like just going to your local supermarket to get sugar or flour. They had become so desensitized to the humanity of the slave that they did not see them as human beings.
Buyers demand the most fertile slaves for breeding. The most expensive are light-skinned teenage virgins. Rape is common. Eliza's from the state plantation. She's being sold with her 2 children, Emily and Randall. In Louisiana, it's illegal for children under 11 to be taken from their parents. It happens all the time.
You know, 140 years is not a really long time in the context of history. So it's hard for me to believe that blacks didn't have any rights here. They weren't treated as human beings. They were treated like animals, essentially.
So please.
Over half the sales at auction will tear a family apart.
If you've ever been 8, to think of being separated from your mother and your father and sold and you'll never see them again. The horror of that, the poignancy of all of that, and yet that's the kind of thing that happened across the South up until the end of slavery.
Get my final offer. The woman's there, $700.
Please, oh my child.
I have seen mothers kissing for the last time the faces of their dead offspring, but never have I seen such an exhibition of intense grief as when Eliza was parted from her child.
Okay, nothing there that I don't think you guys really know, but I thought they did a good job there, kind of depicting the emotion of the scene. And obviously it matched what you just read with Solomon Northup. There's some key things to pull out of it. The cost, by 1860, male slaves were going for 1,000, which would be 31,000 in today's money, women for 800. I also thought Al Sharpton's quote, desensitized to the humanity of the slaves, is clearly seen in that video. And you just wonder yourself, how is that paternalistic, anything that's going on there? You know, that woman, basically what happened there is the son was sold to a plantation, she was sold to another, and her daughter stayed where they were currently at. So she was completely removed from her children in that incident, and yelled at and threatened with flogging for grieving about it. Where's the humanism or the paternalism in that? So that's what they mean by being brutal sights. Now, you guys did a pretty good job of this question the other day, so I wanted to address this when we talk about resistance. And to me, as I've said many times, the powerful American stories are people overcoming oppression or maintaining their culture and oppression, or being successful with the opportunities they have. I think that's part of the great things that happen. But it's interesting that slaves did resist. You know, sometimes students will ask, well, why did they just resist? And there was actually resistance quite frequently, as you noted from chapter 12. But the open resistance was not very frequent, right? Because that often had some devastating consequences. So the more prevalent resistance was the subtle resistance, right? And you guys covered this pretty well in our discussion the other day in the questions. So completely submissive and obedient. There's really a kind of a range, if you're kind of getting what I got on the slide here. To be completely submissive and obedient was actually small in number. Most slaves are not like that, just completely like, yes, I'll do whatever you say all the time. Because once again, there's really no incentive to. There's very little chance to be promoted or anything. So why would you be that way, right? The subtle resistance is what occurred quite often. The resistance that wasn't as noticeable, right? Which you guys are aware of. I'll remind you of in a second. And then, of course, the complete resistance, the open rebellion. While those did occur, those are small in number because of the consequences that occurred. So let's take a look at some of this. So subtle resistance, once again, think of chapter 12. Think about the question you had. Stealing food, faking illness, working slowly, taking advantage of the fact that they were believed to be ignorant and that they had to be paternalistically taken care of. Oh, I don't know how to do this. Oh, I'm sorry, I broke this, right? Kind of like faking things at times, right? Some, of course, did run away And this is a picture of the Underground Railroad. Now, of course, kids, Underground Railroad wasn't actually an Underground Railroad. It was called Underground because it was sneakily trying to get people out of slavery. But what I love showing kids about this map is the importance of Ohio and Underground Railroad, right? Excuse me. Look at all the trails going through Ohio. Incredibly significant state for the Underground Railroad. There is a great Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati, which I have been to. My daughter Anna did a project on it, and her and I and her mother went down. We spent a weekend in Cincinnati and went to it. It's a fantastic. It's right across the Ohio River, which is kind of seen as, you get across that river, you got at least a better chance of freedom in a free state, right? And of course, the key person to mention with the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman, who I believe they made a movie about in this past year that I have not seen. Probably another one I should watch one of these days. Harriet Tubman, of course, was an ex-slave fugitive who risked her life countless times, would go back into slave states and help rescue others, and try and get them really up in Ohio, but on into Canada, right? Canada was welcoming to African Americans. There are a lot of free communities in Canada, and that was a place to get to if you wanted the most security. Probably still times people in Canada were kidnapped back into slavery, but that's where you wanted to get to. Okay. So I want to deal with one event, and this will probably close out our class today because there's actually another video I want to show you here. Told you I wasn't going to get a lot of notes today. Maybe that's okay. It's Friday, right? And I'll be posting these. Make sure you respond. You'll get 10 points for your response, guys. 5 points for listening, 5 points for asking me a good question or a comment on today's lecture or Tuesdays. But there were times there was open resistance, outright resistance. Your text actually mentioned two. Maybe you remember them mentioning one in Louisiana, in which the perpetrators were executed and their heads were put on pikes and displayed along the Mississippi River. That one was mentioned. The one I want to focus on is a more popularly focused one on, and that is Nat Turner's Rebellion, which some of you described to me on your homework the other day, so you're aware of this. But this is going to involve many slaves in Virginia. It actually occurred after several years of planning. This was not like a, hey, let's revolt tomorrow thing. This was planned. Nat Turner was literate. He had read much of the Bible, knew the Bible, considered himself a preacher, believed he was chosen by God to lead this revolt, and believed that he was going to give his life and willing to give his life. He believed what happened to him is essentially what he believed was going to happen, that he was going to give his life in the name of Black freedom. They killed about 60 whites. All right. Basically what they did is they raided several homes of Virginia planters. It was very violent. The planters and family members were killed, angry, right? But of course it was not successful. Turner and others were executed, and many slaves were killed as random at well. So slaves that weren't involved were killed by angry whites. So kind of a counter riot broke out afterwards. Turner was hanged and skinned. Over 200 blacks were killed by white mobs. Let me show you the video and then give you the consequence of this, and then I'll go ahead and stop for today. So I'm going to go a little bit over, which with you kids I'm allowed to do. But let me show you the video and give you the consequence of this, and then we'll be done. Okay? And it actually shows up better on this link here. So about 3.5 minutes here.
Turner's 1831 slave rebellion stuns the nation and pushes the South's slave policing system to its limits.
For white Virginians and white slaveholders across the South, it was a shock.
Paranoia shoots off the scale. 50 dead today, how many dead tomorrow?
In Southampton County, Virginia, Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher, has his own interpretation of the Bible. He believes that God has chosen him to avenge the sins of slavery. As Turner makes his rounds preaching in the field, he quietly enlists other slaves to his cause. For months, the men meet secretly, conspiring on the plans of their uprising. In the early morning hours of August 21st, 1831, Turner and his men launched one of the largest slave rebellions in American history. The rebels moved from home to home, killing every white person they meet. As they advanced towards the nearby town of Jerusalem, more recruits joined them. The local slave patrollers have failed to uncover Turner's plot. So the militia is called out to track down and kill the rebels. For 36 hours, the rebellion rages on. Church bells ring out in distress. Rumors spread among whites that the whole southern slave population has finally exploded in revolt, and that the British are invading to liberate the slaves. As panic swells, the United States government provides important military support. And that support is ensured by slaveholder power.
Don't forget that slavery is protected not only by the slaveholder, not only by the local militia or the state militia, but also by the full force of the military might of the United States of America. Except for that, slavery would not have been possible in the South.
As the hunt for Nat Turner and his men continues, 800 U.S. troops join 2,000 local militiamen. Within a week, the rebellion is squashed. More than 50 rebels are captured. Nearly 60 white men, women, and children have been killed. The violence doesn't fully subside until Nat Turner is captured 2 months later on October 31st, not by a patrol or slave catcher, but by a farmer, by accident. Turner is tried, hanged, and skinned. In all, the state executes 55 black people for conspiring with Turner.
The Turner Rebellion frightened whites literally out of their minds, and yet even that wasn't strong enough to provoke them to get rid of slavery as an institution.
Because for slave owners, profit outweighs morality and their own safety. By 1830, nearly 2 million slaves are fueling the Southern economy, and slaveholders aren't about to give up their free labor. And still, slaves run, and slave hunters expand their networks for tracking them.
Okay, I thought that was a good, quick summary of Nat Turner's Rebellion, right? And the key thing that I think they were trying to instruct you on there at the end is, so here's an opportunity, right? This happens in 1831, so it's 1830s. And the Virginia legislature actually, after the rebellion, considered, well, I don't know, maybe we should abolish slavery. This is pretty bad. These people are upset. They don't like this. But instead, the opposite response occurred. There were more repressive laws put in place towards blacks, both slave and free. And then those laws, what they did is they limited travel, and they limited how many blacks could congregate together. I forget the number. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but only a certain amount of blacks could be together without a white man present and things like that, or there was a church service or whatever. So things got more strict. And of course, the video talks again about the growth in slaves. 2 million at that point, will be 4 million by the time of the Civil War. And the profitability of it are some of the reasons for that, despite the fear of slave rebellion that existed. Okay, so I got to stop there, of course. I could lecture on this stuff for 4 hours, which I'm sure you guys would love, right? But just be aware that there's some other good things on here that you might want to take a look at. Maybe even ask me a question about. You don't have to ask me a question about stuff I talked about. There's some stuff on here about biblical justifications for slavery, but also how slaves were inspired by the Bible as well. There are verses in the Bible that seem to justify slavery, but then there are verses in the Bible and stories in the Bible that talk about slaves acquiring their freedom, right? So you see these two groups using the Bible for different purposes. And then some other justifications for slavery that maybe weren't in the text. There's the Northern Factory one, which many of you are aware of. You mentioned that, okay? But then also, there's a slide on here about the free black population that existed in parts of the South, and then it gets into Southern society a little bit. Okay, so there's a lot. I just came up with a lot, and unfortunately my time is limited with you guys these days, and I don't want to lecture every day, but I still want to share them with you. If you have any questions about this stuff, that I didn't talk about, feel free to ask because I'd love to discuss it with you, at least digitally. Okay, so that's your assignment over the weekend. Respond to the lecture from this week, whether it be Tuesday or today, or even the notes I didn't get to. Friday, I'm going to talk to you for just a little bit, and I want you to get started. I want you to do a writing on Douglass, so just be prepared for that. It's a writing that you should be able to do in one night. Okay, but next week will be a little bit of a busy week. Okay, any questions, kids? It's always a busy week, right?
I have a couple questions if you're willing to stay after class ends.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else? All right, guys, if you want to stick around, I don't know, Josh, is this about class or just about something else?
It's about this, but I have a long series of questions.
Well, if you guys want to leave, you can, or if you want to listen to Josh's questions, you can. It's up to you. I know you're busy. Go ahead and start asking, Josh. What do you got?
So I feel like my first big one that will like kind of spread out from there is the organization of a quote unquote police force in America.
Mm-hmm.
So in other parts of the world, I'm trying to pull from a lot of different places right now. In like England, like in the Victorian era, around the same time, like 1800s beyond, police forces were set up more so due to the fact that, like, yeah, crime was a thing, and sort of they had like a proto police force, but they just needed like not regimented, but a more centralized